following is a time-lapse video of a complete build of the Mojotone British 18-watt amplifier head kit. This kit was built over a 12-day period, working an average of about 2.5 hours per day. The total elapsed bench time was 26 hours and 45 minutes, calculated based on 48,153 frames that I shot with one frame every 2 seconds. So what you're now watching is a full build of the Mojotone British 18-watt amp head kit from start to finish. So the first thing I had to do was drill some mounting holes in the head cabinet to mount the chassis. So this was one of the things I was the most worried about because I didn't want to screw this up and have to drill multiple holes. The instructions from the Tube Depot assembly manual were actually pretty helpful on this. So I pretty much did it as described in that manual, and it worked out pretty well. I got it, got a nice good fit in my first try, and once I had done that, I put the cabinet back on the shelf and didn't need it again until the very end. So the first order of business on the chassis was installing the transformers. So again, followed the Tube Depot documentation since there really isn't any other than the layout. There were a few screws that I thought were missing. However, I did find those. One thing you can see installing the grommets for the output transformer, I installed it per the Tube Depot documentation, and that turns out actually being reversed from the Mojotone layout. I didn't check the Mojotone layout carefully enough. Once I caught it, I decided to leave it the way Tube Depot had it. I thought the output transformer wires kind of routed a little more cleanly using that layout. Next was installing all of the tube sockets, V1 through V6 tube sockets. Right here, I wish I would have installed grommets on V1 for shock isolation. That's something that the Tube Depot guys do. I did not add that initially, but decided to go back and add it later, and had to be very careful because I'd already soldered a lot of components in at the time I made that decision. So initially I went ahead and installed all the jacks and potentiometers, just kind of to make sure everything fit. I knew I was going to have to take these out at some point, but I just wanted to get everything in there, make sure everything fit, that I had all the parts. So Mojotone provided two 3-lug terminal strips. They don't talk about that on their layout. They don't mention where to put it. They do kind of show roughly a couple of grounding points. I did use those as my main grounding point on the chassis. So most of this is self-explanatory. I've got subtitles showing you what I'm doing and when. So what I'm doing here is twisting the wire that's going to be the filament wiring. This was by far, I think, the most tedious part of the whole build process. It's an important part. I tried to take my time with it, but it is very tedious to get these filaments wired up. And you can see here, I did make a mistake following the Tube Depot documentation where they take that red and black filament wire and run it up to a point on the turret board up near the front of the chassis where they then tie in the transformer as well. Luckily I caught that pretty quickly, was able to reuse all of that wire by untwisting it. Again, I should have been checking the Mojotone documentation more clearly and not following the Tube Depot documentation. I think I confused myself by using two sets of documentation, trying to take the best from both. I got ahead of myself a couple of times. So I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about why I decided on the Mojotone kit versus Tube Depot or some of the other options available out there. Basically, I compared the schematics and the layout of the different vendors, mainly Mojotone and Tube Depot, to the original Marshall schematics. There were some other things that kind of tilted the scale in favor of Mojotone. I like that their turret board was already pre-assembled. With Tube Depot, you have to drill and install the turrets yourself. I really wanted to focus more on the electrical aspect and not the mechanical aspect of the build, even though there is quite a bit of that in any kit that you build. Also, the chassis was completely pre-drilled in the Mojotone. I think the Tube Depot chassis is mostly drilled, but there appears to be some things that you have to add or tweak. Now, the Tube Depot has awesome documentation, and I relied on their documentation quite a bit, and took some of the improvements that they recommend and implemented those into my Mojotone build. I'll talk about some of those later. Tube Depot has been great to work with. I've ordered a lot of parts from them. Good folks. They're in my hometown of Memphis, Tennessee, so that was kind of refreshing. Mojotone, great support during the sales phase. However, they've been a little bit slow to respond in terms of some technical questions. I'll talk about that more a little later as well. So I'll talk about some of the improvements that I took from Tube Depot. I added the 33K grid stopper resistors to both of the jacks in the normal channel. That's something that's shown on the Tube Depot schematic pretty clearly as an option, but it's not shown or not really mentioned by Mojotone at all. So that was something I thought I would add to make sure there were no radio frequencies getting into my input stage. I also used shielded cable per the Tube Depot documentation versus Mojotone's unshielded cable for the inputs to the V1 and the V3 stage for the two channels. Another thing I did that I wish I would have done from the very beginning is I did decide to go ahead and shock mount the V1 tube sockets. I decided that a little bit late, and it caused me to have to take some extraordinary measures. I had to use some tape to try to catch the metal shavings. Needed to make sure there was nothing in there floating around that could short out any of the components. It also required a trip to the hardware store to buy some longer screws. The screws supplied by Mojotone were not long enough to secure that V1 tube socket once the grommets were installed. The majority of the work was done right here at this bench, and you'll see 99.9% of it from the beginning to the end. I did have a fan that I used when I was soldering. It may not be visible in the time-lapse video. It might have been under the shelf that's above my workbench. But always use a fan when you're soldering. I've also developed the practice of holding my breath while I solder. Also, Mojotone offers a standard knob, the same knob that they give you for all the volume and tone controls. They supply that same knob for the impedance selector, which is a pretty hard switch to turn. So I did order a chicken head knob from Tube Depot and installed that instead on the impedance selector. It's on the rear panel, so you don't really see it anyway, and it makes it much easier to turn. As I mentioned, I relied pretty heavily on the Tube Depot documentation. They provide a really good assembly manual, some very detailed documents that make it a lot easier to understand. There are some pitfalls to doing that, and there were several cases where it caused me some rework because I was just marching along following the Tube Depot documentation and realized that that's not the way they do it on the Mojotone schematics and layout. One example of that is the 220K resistor that goes onto V3 between pin 1 and pin 6, which are the plates of the two triodes. Tube Depot mounts that resistor on the tube socket, while Mojotone mounts it on the turret board. I could have left it that way, however I decided to go ahead and order another one and move that up to the turret board just to be consistent. Tube Depot also uses a jumper on the tube socket on V1 between the two grids, between pin 2 and pin 7. Mojotone doesn't do that. Each of the normal inputs drives a separate grid. So I had installed that jumper, had to go back in and remove that once I looked closer. Just a case of me being excited to make progress and moving a little too fast. The normal channel on Tube Depot has a high and a low impedance input, and both of those inputs are then tied together and go to both the V1A and the V1B grids, pins 2 and 7. On the Mojotone design, the normal inputs are identical, and each one drives a separate grid of the dual triodes in the V1 position. The filament wiring is another difference. On the Tube Depot layout, they take the filament wiring from V5 and they run it up to the turret board, and then they connect to the transformer on the turret board. Mojotone basically takes the transformer leads and puts them directly onto that V5 socket. It's more of a direct route, so that caused a little bit of rework there. Luckily I caught it pretty quickly. I'll talk about a few other differences that I encountered along the way. The first is the foot switch wiring is a little bit different between the two designs. Mojotone offers a second switch to control the speed between a high speed and a low speed option. That is an option on Tube Depot, but that's not part of their standard build. In fact, I'm not sure I like that option. Basically what it seems to do is take the range of speed that you get in the normal Marshall design and splits it into two. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to go change that back and make it more consistent with the original Marshall design. However, I need to order a different value pot to change that speed control. So that'll be some more rework that I'll have to do, but I don't really see the value in having a foot switch to switch between the two speeds, because depending on a tempo of a song, you're probably going to have to tweak it manually anyway. Another difference is in the tremolo intensity circuits. There's a difference between how Tube Depot and how Mojotone implement those. Mojotone basically gives you a wider range of intensity than the original Marshall circuit. Not by much, but a little bit. And I'm not sure why Tube Depot uses the cathode resistor value that they use. It's quite a bit higher than Mojotone's and also the original Marshall circuit. So I need to do some more analysis there. The input jacks that were provided with the Mojotone kit are not the normal cliff jacks from the UK. I thought they were. However, one of those inputs is bad. It's intermittent. I looked a little deeper and found out that the jacks that were provided are from China, from a company called CHD, not Cliff, which kind of pissed me off, but I'm going to have to now go back in and rework that. I've ordered original Cliff jacks from Tube Depot, and I'm trying to decide whether to replace the one bad one or take all of them out and replace all of them. I'll probably do the latter. Another difference is the resistor and capacitor that are connected to the cathodes of the output tubes in V4 and V5, the EL84s. The values are different between Tube Depot and Mojotone. Mojotone appears to be a little closer to the original Marshall circuit based on what I've found on the internet. I'm not sure how those differences in values affect the tone of the amp, if at all. I had to make a decision on whether to follow the Mojotone documentation and do the underboard wiring as it's shown, or a buddy of mine suggested, it might be better to have those jumpers on the top of the board for debugging. You can actually see which turret connects to which one. I originally was going to just use a Sharpie, a silver Sharpie, and just put dotted lines on the top of the board to show where those connections were. I did go ahead and wipe those off a little bit later using acetone for a cleaner look. I think that is a potentially a good idea though, but it's easy to pull out the layout diagram and check your connections if you're debugging. This was another kind of tricky part of the build, and wiring the ground bus wires to the back of the pots. It sure would be nice if these pot manufacturers would kind of give you a tab or something to make it a little easier to ground. I'm not great at soldering onto the back of a pot like that. Need some more practice, but I was worried that I was getting too much heat on there. And it's not as pretty as I would have liked it to be, but I think I got good solid connections, and functionally it works. Like I said, it's just not very pretty. Near the end of this, you'll see some standard video footage of me powering up the amp for the first time, measuring voltages and testing the amp, the different inputs and tone controls and volume controls to make sure everything worked okay. And the video then ends with a final time lapse of me mounting the chassis into the cabinet. I took a lot of time on the wiring of the input jacks. I did make some changes. I added grid stopper resistors. I was really making sure I understood how those jacks worked. As it turns out, I did find a discrepancy in the Mojotone documentation. the schematic shows one thing and the layout shows another. The layout I believe is correct, but that slowed me down a little bit, and I did have to just pull out my ohm meter and take some measurements and make sure I understood exactly how these jacks were working. I also decided to install the post phase inverter master volume mod that Tube Depot points out in their documentation. I went ahead and mounted it on the rear panel versus the front. I'm still debating that decision. It's a little bit of a pain to have it on the rear, although it does preserve the vintage look of the amp by keeping all 4 input jacks intact. I still may go back and move that master volume control up to the front, however. So you can see here how far along I'd gotten before I decided to go and install the grommets to isolate the V1 tube socket from the chassis. I had to take some extra precautions on this since I had a lot of, all the tube jacks were in and partially wired. So I used blue painter's tape and kind of created a dam around that tube socket and was very careful to catch all the metal shavings and cleaned it up really good afterwards. So I didn't want to leave anything in there that could potentially short later. So the way I film this time lapse is I have a GoPro Hero 4 mounted above the workbench that I can control with my iPhone to start and stop. I set up the time lapse with 1 photo every 2 seconds. That gives about 30 shots a minute. I can also use that to calculate how much time I was at the bench. Now this doesn't count hours of planning and looking at schematics and ordering parts, etc. But it's the hands-on time that you'll be seeing here. Each day I would take all the photos off the SD card and load those into a separate folder for each day's worth of time-lapse. I then pulled these files into Final Cut Pro 10. I then set each photo to 1 frame in duration, and I put it in a project with 24 frames per second. I also did a 2-frame version where each photo was 2 frames long. That makes it a little easier to watch, but of course doubles the time. So this video would have been over an hour had I used the 2-frame version. Something I did not do here, as I was soldering these components onto the turrets, a friend of mine made a suggestion of using an alligator clip as a heat sink to make sure you're not damaging the components. It takes about 20 seconds to heat that turret up enough to get a good solder connection. So don't believe that that's enough time to damage any of these components, but it's a good idea to just put an alligator clip on there as an additional heat sink. I plan to do that on my next build. I'll post an index in the description showing the timestamps for all the different phases of the amp build. So if you want to jump to one particular section for reference, you can look in the description and see that index. Some of the tools that were really valuable during this build, first off, my Weller digital soldering station. It's great soldering iron. I'll put a link to that in the description. I bought it on Amazon. Also, it's important to have a fan to blow the solder away from your face. You don't want to be inhaling that, and just like shooting a gun, sometimes it's a good idea to hold your breath before you pull the trigger. That's a good habit to get into. Is just hold your breath while you're soldering. I also, you'll see in the video, the yellow magnetic base behind the amp is a helping hand device called Quad Hands. I bought mine on Amazon, highly recommend it. It's great quality, it's American made. It's more expensive than the Chinese ones, but I think it's worth it, and you'll be glad that you paid the extra money. I'll also put that link in the description. Another good thing to have is a solder sucker and some solder wick, because you will make mistakes and you'll want to go back and clean up some solder joints. So that's a good thing to have on hand. I'll also post another video shortly showing a demo of the tones that you can get out of this amp. Since I've just recently finished the build, I'm still playing with it and figuring it out myself, so I'll post something soon. I took a little extra time to pre-measure the lengths of wire I was going to need for all of the flying wire connections, and just made a little spreadsheet and listed out how many lengths of wire I needed of each color, how long they needed to be, and that saved a lot of time when I started cutting all those and tinning them. So in summary, I'm pretty happy with the Mojotone kit. As I mentioned, I really wish they would provide higher quality components. They do have a note on their website that kind of gives them an out. It says that they reserve the right to make substitutions. However, it would be nice if you could say, hey, I'll wait longer. Make sure you give me the best parts I can get. A lot of the vendors are good in their own ways. Of course, this is the first one that I've built, so I don't have a lot to compare to, but I have done a lot of research on all of them. I mentioned the crappy Chinese input jacks that I got, which is going to cause me to have to go back and rework that one or perhaps all of them. Or perhaps just live with it. However, I'm not really a live with it kind of guy. Another thing is, don't be in a rush. Take your time. Make sure you've got all the components, the wires, and everything that you need to make a certain connection before you solder it. Rework is inevitable, but try to minimize that as best you can through good planning. So I highly recommend looking at the other vendors' documentation for whatever amp kit you're interested in building, and take the best ideas from each of them, especially if you have any basic circuit knowledge. So one issue I found, the input jacks come with 2 fiber washers. Initially I used both of those when I mounted the input jacks. Unfortunately, the turret board will not clear those input jacks if both of those washers are installed. I removed one. It looked like it was going to still be too tight of a fit, so I ended up removing both of those washers. I believe I could get away with one washer and still have enough clearance to mount the turret board, but that does mount right up against the back of those jacks. I'm currently looking at Trinity amps for my next build. I need to call them and talk to them, but basically it looks like they really pride themselves on offering the best quality of genuine parts. So I'm going to look at them for my next build, which will be a Tweed Deluxe 5E3 circuit. I think that'll be a fun one to build. So as I was testing the connections on the post-phase inverter master volume, I realized that I had accidentally ordered the wrong value. So I had to reorder. I went ahead and ran all the wires to that pot, and then when I received my correct pot, the 500K pot, it was a quick job to just put the new one in and solder everything up. That was my last step, and then I was ready for testing. So we're plugged into a speaker cabinet. We're also plugged in through the dim bulb tester, and you can see we're drawing some current. And we've got a signal going in from a loop station into the input. Volume works. Tone works. We're first time functional. And you can see the master volume circuit works. I'd call this a success. So this was the first amp kit that I built. I had an absolute blast doing it. It's a lot of fun. I spread it out over over 12 days, so never had to work more than a couple hours a day, which my wife really appreciated. And I'll be building another amp. I might have to start selling some and to make room for more, because I really enjoy the process of building it, testing it. You learn a lot, and you have a great sense of accomplishment when you finally plug it into your speaker cabinet and get to listen to it. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was informative, and good luck if you decide to build one of these. Thanks for watching.